Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, and a special hello to Peter Winters, who listens to the show in Richmond over in the US. He emailed to say, "I've just finished listening to your podcast with the Mastermind guy. Amazing story. Huge thanks for sharing." And he also shared with me how he was putting together automation tools that will help improve results in his business, such as custom graphic displays for trade shows, events and corporate spaces, etc. So, Peter, if you are listening, I have replied to your email, and I meant what I said when I said, when you get this up and running, there is an open invitation for you to come on to this show. I'm very keen to tear down that fourth wall and feature listeners' voices and listener stories on this show too. So a big thank you for your email, Peter, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you on this show really, really soon. But as for today's show, I've invited Kevin O'Brien onto the show today, and he's the CEO of a company called GreatHorn. And Kevin's going to talk about phishing and how it continues to be a primary security problem for businesses. And anyone that's worked in a corporate environment will know somebody that's clicked on one of those dodgy links or downloaded that dodgy attachment. And equally, we've probably all got a family member that's done something similar too. But GreatHorn is an email security company that's doing something about this and utilising machine learning to automate this identification and remediate advanced email and social engineering attacks to finally put a stop to these attacks. It's a really cool conversation about a topic that I suspect every single person listening to me speak here has encountered at some point. And if they haven't, if they're one of the lucky ones, I'm pretty sure they know somebody that has. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to the Boston, Massachusetts area so we can speak with Kevin O'Brien, CEO of GreatHorn. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Kevin. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Certainly, Neil. My name is Kevin O'Brien. I am the CEO and co-founder of GreatHorn. We are a cloud-native email security company based in the Boston area in Massachusetts. My background is in cybersecurity. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I was an early member of @Stake, famous here in the United States because it was founded by a group of guys coming out of a hacking group called the Loft, or more properly Loft Heavy Industries. And they stood up in front of the Senate in 1996 and talked about how the internet could be taken offline in about a half hour, and they thought that might be a problem. And from there, started a company just a few short years later. I was there more or less at the beginning, maybe within 6 months of the company getting started. I was very young, but fell in love with cybersecurity and fell in love with startups. And this is number 6 for me now. I've been part of a number of high growth companies. And knock on wood, all of them have been successfully acquired or exited prior to GreatHorn.
Wow, okay, you have got entrepreneurial blood running in your veins if you're on your 6th startup. But when I was researching you guys, I quickly found that GreatHorn was the finalist in the 2017 RSA Innovation Sandbox for its ability to utilise machine learning and automate identification and remediate advanced email and social engineering attacks. But can you offer the listeners an overview of exactly what problems it is you solve for businesses, and also what makes you stand out from all those other solutions out there?
The business problems that GreatHorn tries to solve are issues around advanced email threat. And to understand what that means, you have to understand a little bit of history of email security. Probably around the time that I was getting started in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you start to see organizations purchasing third-party solutions for email risk. But the risks in those days were very different from the ones that we face today. They were spam and gray mail being effectively not malicious mail, but anything that you don't want. Email continuity. In the old days, when you still ran an Exchange server, most likely, and it was on a server rack and had a patch cable running to it, well, if the intern, like I was back in the early days, kicked that patch cable out, your email server went offline. And so there were services people bought from a continuity perspective to maintain access to email should that happen. Those companies became email security companies over the intervening 15 years or so. But largely, they've failed to keep up with the move to cloud. As organizations begin to use Office 365 or G Suite, the Google offering, One of the things that changes is that these problems go away. Spam and email continuity, the reliable keeping of archives, they're basically solved for by those platform providers. But there are other risks that are coming about, because one of the things that people don't understand about email is that it is still, despite it being a very, very old system, it's 47 years old, the single most reliable way to get in touch with someone from a professional perspective. And so attackers and bad guys know this too. They will go after organizations by sending a variety of different attack types. Some of them are very familiar to the average individual user of mail at home, right? They'll see the Nigerian prince email that says you've won $10 million or whatnot. But there are also business variants of that are far more sophisticated, that look like a login to your corporate intranet or a file that's been shared with you by a trusted vendor, where the bad guy finds a way to impersonate a senior executive in a company you work for. And it looks exactly like the email that you would get from your chief financial officer or your chief executive officer. And so those types of attack emails are responsible for the vast majority of the data breaches that we see in the world. And that is where we step in. GreatHorn uses two things very differently from these legacy providers. The first is that we, as you alluded to, use a combination of sophisticated machine learning and technology techniques so that we can identify and respond to these risks and identify them more effectively than a traditional gateway-driven approach, what the old guard used to do. And the second is that we're cloud native ourselves. So in the same way that we've now moved our infrastructure into the services provided by these cloud companies, GreatHorn is built for and runs in those environments. And it allows us to couple what we do more tightly to their infrastructure. And for a professional in the information security team at your company, using GreatHorn, now not only do you see the threats more accurately than you used to be able to do so, you can remediate them. That is, you can delete them or respond to them in a much more cloud native way. And the net of all of that, technology aside, is that we reduce how long it takes a company to identify that they're under cyber attack over email and respond to it. And we do it much, much more effectively and efficiently and accurately than these legacy providers can offer.
Now, phishing continues to be a primary security problem for businesses. And I'm fairly confident in saying that almost every person listening to us today would have received a spoof email on an almost daily basis that contain banking instructions or invoice confirmations or message from their bank that all look surprisingly legit, but ask for their credentials or notes from friends that look real, that have an attachment that they wasn't necessarily expecting. So are you finding that businesses are wanting to educate not only their staff, but also their customers about these threats as well?
Education is certainly part of the answer. And the answer is yes to your question. What you generally will find is that phishing, which you described accurately here from the volumetric perspective, and I'll come back to that in a second, is actually a category that contains another level of sophistication, which is targeted phishing, and that's non-volumetric. Volumetric phishing is what you've described. We've all received these emails. I jokingly call them the Nigerian prince email, but they're effectively just attempts to get people to do things that they shouldn't based on a fairly rough impersonation of your bank or your real estate company. And those are generally well served through education and technical control. And Google and Microsoft do a fairly effective job at identifying and stopping those. Occasionally, I'll have a spin through my spam folder in my personal Gmail account, and it's astounding how many millions of dollars I've received and how many widows there are around the world looking to send it to me. But the difference of what we're describing from a non-volumetric perspective, that is, these targeted attacks, is that education is generally inadequate. And there's two reasons why. The first is that organizationally, if you look at a company and you pick out the senior most executives and you very carefully construct an impersonation or a spoof of one of those people, and you send that to a very carefully selected set of subordinates, you can do things that when you're trying to send 1,000 or 1,000,000 of these messages, you simply cannot do. For example, we saw an attack at one of our customers within the last 6 months, where the attackers had identified two members of the senior leadership team and then watched LinkedIn and tried to figure out when those executives were traveling. They're going to a conference in this case. And when they did travel, that's when they struck with a very well-crafted impersonation from a private email address. I think it was a Gmail address in this circumstance. And everything else about it looked just like the real thing. So when the recipient, who was a member of the finance team, got a message from a CFO saying, I'm on the road, but I've just received this invoice and we're behind on payment. The routing number has changed or the payment number has changed for this particular company. Can you please update this and send it? And the display name was first name, comma, last name, just like it should be. And all of the details were right. And the person was indeed traveling. Well, they fell for it, or they would have. But of course, we identified that that was anomalous and got rid of that message before they could act. But that's very different from, oh, you have to go and log into your bank of whatever account, because those are volumetric and those are easier to determine and pick up. They're still a threat, but we have to understand they're different. And you can't educate people in a way that will effectively teach them to not have a pretty normal response when your boss says, I'm traveling and I have an urgent thing for you to do, because that's actually part of what we consider social engineering. And that's what these targeted phishing attacks are. They're social engineering attacks, and we need to apply a bit more sophistication to the problem.
It's so true what you're saying there. And these attacks are getting more and more sophisticated with each attack. But what are the latest techniques criminals are using? Are there any other examples that you can share?
There are. We're also starting to see a multi-step attack that goes from business email compromise, BEC, which is the scenario that I just described, to business service spoofing, or BSS. And we security professionals love our acronyms, but what we mean by business service spoofing is that now I will take a file and I will put it into something that looks like a file sharing service. Perhaps it's Dropbox, or it's a third-party Google environment that I connect to Google Drive. And inside of the file is the attack vector. And I then share that with the recipient. And I say, I need you to go and update whatever system. And the file contains either a direct attack or a link. Or if I'm particularly clever, I will create a fake of what looks like Google or Dropbox. And if you go to log into it, it'll steal your credentials when you log into that system, that Dropbox system. And then it will silently redirect you to the real Dropbox. And what will happen is that the credential theft occurred when it said, please log in and view this file. And it's a pixel perfect representation of that login page. And then it fails because it's not really Dropbox, let's say, and redirects you to the real Dropbox. They stole your credentials. You think you just had a typo in putting your password in. You re-enter your password. Oh, you're actually in Dropbox now. Ah, no file. That's odd. Something must have gone wrong. But the experience is so close to fat fingering a password or mistyping a password that the recipient typically doesn't know. If, as an attacker, you invest in that kind of infrastructure and you commit that kind of work and time to it, what you're probably going to do then is sit on those credentials for 3 months, maybe 6, watch how these people interact, and then replicate the attack or use a secondary attack. This is the multi-step piece in the future. But you now know exactly how that individual emails, what their tone is, who they're going after. And so another example from, in this case, a prospective client of ours that we're working on making a member of our customer base, they had exactly that happen. And then 3 months after the attack had begun, thousands of their end users or their customers received now legitimate mail from this particular set of accounts that they had been watching, the attackers had been watching and compromised. And those emails to their customers stole data from their customers. They're in the healthcare industry, so you can imagine how sensitive this information is. This kind of business service spoofing is even harder to detect because once that first little moment passes where you have the fake login, everything else is completely legitimate. The messages that steal data down the line are legitimate. So you have to start to look for ways that you can not just think about how do we block bad mail. That's the old school. But how do we have a continuous analysis model that gives us insight all the way through the life cycle of how people are interacting over this medium so that you have a better chance of stopping it and not just a one-off chance of stopping it.
So when it comes to those popular carriers such as Office 365 and the Outlook email addresses and the Google Suite, which we all know and love, and nearly everybody listening is going to have one of those email addresses, are there any email security shortcomings that people listening might be unaware of and they need to better protect themselves against?
We use one of those providers ourselves, and we're an email security company. And I think that speaks to the fact that my answer is no, they're very reliable. I have a preference for one over the other personally, and I think that there's been some real innovation. But they've both spent a lot of time building foundational protections into their models. There's a difference with cloud infrastructure from on-premise infrastructure, however. And my former company, 2 companies ago, was a cloud access security broker company called CloudLock, and we sold it to Cisco some years ago, so this isn't a pitch. But the idea here was that once you've moved to the cloud and you start putting files into the file systems that those cloud providers allow, this was the CloudLock story, then you had a responsibility for ensuring that only the right people inside of your company were able to open those files, and that only the right people inside of your company could share them externally. And if someone made a mistake, or if they were compromised in some fashion and those permissions were abused, that wasn't a failing in Dropbox or Salesforce or Google or Microsoft. That was an internal security policy failure. And there's technology, we made it, that you could invest in to help monitor and identify and respond to those threats. It's the same story now with email. When you think about email security, there are things that you absolutely have to rely on Google or Microsoft to do. You should know that basic malware that's well known to the security community and exists on what are called blacklists or known identified file hashes for that malware or ransomware, that stuff will be removed and generally put in your junk folder, or that things that are very obviously attacks will be filtered out. But these impersonations, if somebody goes and registers kevin.whatever.o'brien@gmail.com, and it's not my email address, but they get my picture and they put it in and they start doing various things to make that email address look real, and then they send an email to, say, my controller and ask for a wire transfer for a vendor or an update to our accounting systems to change a routing number. Is that Google's problem? Is that a failure at the platform level if that kind of an attack gets through? I would say no, because maybe that's really my email address, and maybe it's not. Maybe I just registered one and I'm using it for these wire transfers for some reason. This is where what we are doing overlaps with, and in many ways differs from, platform level protections. So it's not the case when you think about this problem that, oh, we're filling a hole that was left by the platform providers, but rather we're saying every company has a unique set of security conditions, email characteristics and sending patterns, and acceptable use. And enforcing that can either be done laboriously and manually, or you can invest in technology that augments your existing capabilities. And generally speaking, if the vendor is doing its job, the return on investment from that is significant because it takes less time and is more universally applicable than doing it manually through your highly paid information security team. Let them handle the exceptional cases, not the day-to-day stuff. Let a company like ours step in and help remediate those threats before they become security incidents that need manual attention.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning of the episode here about in the good old days where you could actually trip over a cable and take out an entire email server. But traditionally, corporate email was protected when it was in-house by company firewalls and secure email gateways that all acted as almost a virtual moat. But the rise of cloud services, and in particular cloud email services, are they leaving businesses vulnerable because they just presume that those big providers are protecting them?
If you asked me that question 5 years ago, my answer would have been yes, because I think that there was a change in technology and it took some time for people to understand it. Today, I think that organizations understand that firewalls and secure email gateways represent an outmoded way of looking at information security. They are perimeter security tools. And it's almost become a cliche that perimeter security is not sufficient. And so every vendor in the world tries to talk about why they're not a perimeter security tool. But the delta between protection and what we used to do is perhaps a little bit different than what people in information security roles realize or recognize. We've seen an emergence of a market for email security training or security awareness training. And it's a very lucrative market, and the companies that exist within it have had some pretty notable financial success. But it's a shifting of blame from the IT guy didn't stand up a good enough firewall to, well, the user's at fault. We gave them a 30-second video and made them take it 100 times, and they still fell for it. And the problem here is that we have to look at this problem as not just being the same problem in a different environment or someone else's problem, but rather a new problem. And so the perspective here is that organizations that move to these environments know they can't just replicate what they used to do, or they'll come to realize that fairly quickly. And I think that we're at a point now where most understand that. Many have made the move of investing in training and thinking, well, we'll just kick that problem down to the ordinary individual worker and it's up to them. But thankfully, we're now at a moment where we are starting to see purpose-built technology for the cloud that protects those organizations from the threats that are emerging today. And we're starting to see not just GreatHorn, but other vendors stepping into that space. I'm fairly proud of the fact that we were the first ones in that space. We continue to see growth, but there are some others starting to ride on our coattails a little bit. And that's validating because it says we're not just out making money, we're actually solving a real problem.
So can you tell me more about GreatHorn's useful phishing risk calculator and that annual cloud email security report that's recently came out?
Of course. So these two pieces of content are actually tightly coupled. And if you look at the annual state of phishing report that we put together, we run surveys of hundreds and hundreds of professionals and thousands of users. And we look at all of the ways in which people fall victim to these attacks. You can start to weave some patterns together. Among them, that there is a massive gap between what an ordinary user perceives of in terms of threat. So the ordinary user might say, I see an attack maybe once a month, and it's once every out of 4 weeks, I'll see something in my inbox. But if you ask an information security professional, they'll tell you almost universally it's coming out daily, and they're seeing attacks all the time. The ordinary user categorizes most email threats as spam. It's not 1997, and it's probably not spam that you're seeing. It's probably targeted phishing or business email compromise. But that's the language of the information security professionals. So it's very challenging to begin to understand what is happening and how big a problem you have, especially if what you've done is said, well, that's an end user problem, and let's just train them. And they can't even articulate clearly to the professional what's going on. So the email risk calculator builds on that trend data, and it helps an individual organization that might be interested in understanding roughly where their risk is and how they stack up compared to their peers, how likely it is that they're seeing these attacks. And the ways in which we do that are to take some basic information about how large an organization is, how much mail they're getting. In some circumstances, clients will actually use GreatHorn for a period of a week or two, and we won't do any remediation action, but we'll analyze their data and look at their environment, and then generate for them a heuristical score. And we're not trying to nail down a specific number. Oh, you got 13 attacks on Thursday and 18 on Friday, therefore, whatever conclusion you draw from that. But rather, we can benchmark for you. This is roughly what your environment looks like. This is what your peers would see on an average basis. And because we know how long it takes from the vast quantity of data, hundreds of millions of analyzed messages that we've looked at and billions of events over the course of the run of the company so far, how long would it take an information security professional to look at that attack, figure out what the risk was, spend time doing remediation if you're doing it through, say, PowerShell and manual scripting. And we can begin to show an organization, just because you haven't had a data breach, you're spending, on average, millions of dollars on solving a phishing problem or addressing a phishing problem. And so now you can start to say, well, you can actually translate the use of advanced email protection to an efficiency from a labor and at least top line revenue problem, if not a bottom line revenue problem. And so we can start to say, all right, let's go and invest in this. And so that's what the calculator is designed to do. It's a business justification tool for many organizations when they're taking an information security problem and communicating it, say, to a board that understands the financial implications, but may not know all the details of just how wide-ranging this issue is.
Now, this is a subject that affects everyone listening today, whether they be a simple home user or a business, and we could have CEOs listening too. So can you offer a bit of guidance for people listening and to businesses that they could take away and be better protected?
So for an average end user, my advice is this. Whatever email system you're using, you almost certainly have the opportunity to go into your settings and enable multi-factor or two-step authentication. Google allows for this. Office and Outlook and all the other providers allow for this. Do this. Ideally, do this not tied to sending an SMS or text message to your phone when you need to log in, but through the use of a third-party authentication application that you can run on those devices. Google Authenticator or Authy, there are many. The reason that you want to stay away from text messaging is that it's very easy for an attacker, especially an attacker who is focused on maybe your company or your part of the world, to spoof your phone, get those messages, change your password. I actually had a former director from a company that I was part of who had this happen to them, and they lost millions and millions of dollars worth of digital currency. But it was a major attack for them. It was based on someone getting their phone number, spoofing it, resetting the passwords, and even though they had MFA turned on, it wasn't enough. So turn on MFA and turn it on through the use of an application whenever possible. For the CEOs listening, I would say that your challenge is a little bit different. You're going to be in one of three states if you've moved to the cloud. You're going to think that you're protected, as Neil alluded to, and that you don't need to invest in software because the providers themselves will protect you. This is erroneous. You'll discover that one way or the other. The second is that there are advanced protection capabilities that you can purchase. Some of them come from Microsoft or Google at different levels. That's all good and perhaps worth looking into, but understand that those are not purpose-built for the kinds of threats that are going to ultimately result in a compromise of your business data, your intellectual property, or your finances. You have to look outside of just what the platform providers can offer. And there are emerging vendors. We're one of them, but there are others who are doing things very, very differently from the vendors whom you might be familiar with because they've been around for 15 or 20 years. And although that may change in 5 years' time, at least today, and the major analyst communities will back this up. So look at your Forrester researches or your Gartner researches and find out what's there. There is no equivalent to a purpose-built targeted phishing protection platform outside of what the newest vendors on the market who have been around between 3 and 5 years themselves have been working on and doing. And if you just port old legacy technology in, you will be at risk.
Traditionally, a lot of the C-suite have always had trouble actually finding the ROI in cybersecurity or the ROI in protection. Has that changed now from the people that come to speak with yourself? Are they adopting more of a proactive than a reactive approach, or do they come to you after things have gone wrong when it's too late and don't want to do it again?
Everybody comes to the security community from a vendor perspective after things go wrong.
Yeah.
The question is whether or not you're seeing really, I think, more before the event attacks. Yeah. A friend of mine and advisor once said, everyone's been breached. It's just a matter of whether they know it or not. I would say that we're seeing more individual companies coming to us without a specific, we just had an incident and we need help perspective. I think the macro political climate in the world has helped here. Maybe the only piece of good from this. Everyone's aware of the impact that compromised data, email compromises and risks there, cell phone hacking, these sorts of things can have. And because it's now entered the national consciousness, at least here in the United States and certainly in parts of Europe, we're starting to hear different kinds of risk assessments happening. And the second major point that I'll make is that chief information security officers have seen their role changed over the last decade. That change has been from reporting usually to a CIO to reporting to a chief compliance officer, a general counsel, or a chief financial officer. That is to say, security has become a business of measuring and adapting to risk rather than technology. And that makes it much, much easier to say, well, we're doing risk mitigation and we have a model for that. We have it in insurance and we have it in other parts of the business.
So what's next for GreatHorn? Is there anything else you can share with us today about what you guys have got in store for the next 12 to 18 months?
I won't go into details, but we are looking at the problem this way. Email security is not only a problem of adding additional analysis functionality to mail, which is something we do very, very well, but it's actually related to some foundational problems with email. And if you look at the trajectory of that platform over the last 47 years, you'll find that there have been myriad attempts to try to make it more secure. But there is a place and an opportunity for an organization to address the risk problem independent of what email itself is doing. And for a vendor who happens to be sitting on enormous amounts of data and has perspective on legitimate versus illegitimate mail, it could actually be very interesting and even easier and less friction for an end user to do that through that vendor's technology and perspective. So there might be something that we're announcing a little bit later this year or early next around that, and stay tuned.
Excellent. I do love a good teaser as well. But before I do let you go, could you just remind the listeners of where they can find out more information about you guys online and also maybe contact a member of your team if they have any questions after listening to our conversation today?
The best place to find more information about GreatHorn is on our website, www.greathorn.com. You can also find information about us through the various Gartner research reports and cool vendor reports. But if you go to greathorn.com, we have all of that information available and a contact us link where you can reach out to the team if you'd like to have a conversation.
Excellent. Well, I'll add those links to the show notes just so people can find you nice and easy. But one of the things that really highlighted to me from your listening to you there is how attacks have increased in sophistication and things that have evolved so much as well in how we deal with this, from those traditional perimeter security tools to educating staff and that whole blame culture or shifting the blame to actually purpose-built solutions fit for a digital age. And I really want to thank you for coming on today and sharing that story and that evolution of that protection. So thank you.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure.
I'm so glad Kevin came on the show today and highlighted the latest techniques that criminals are using, including the use of display name spoofs, social engineering techniques, an increase in business service impersonation attacks too, where cyber criminals replicate communications from major brands such as Walmart, DocuSign, or take it one step further, and the CEOs themselves. But I'm kind of curious on this. If you're the CEO or you're a tech leader, has your business encountered pretty big problems due to phishing attempts? What was the fallout of one person clicking on that dodgy attachment or clicking on that dodgy link? And how did you overcome the problem as a result? These are real problems that are facing every single business. I'm really interested if businesses are adopting a proactive rather than that traditional reactive approach to security, and what you've all been experienced out there in corporate land. So I know that you've all had this experience, but I want you to step out of that comfort zone and message your friendly podcast host. And the reason I ask this is so I can share your story too, because I think it's going to resonate with a lot of other CEOs, a lot of other tech leaders that are listening. And maybe we could all learn from each other's experiences and how we overcame those challenges. So email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. And if you go over to my website, techblogwriter.co.uk/podcast, you'll also find a way of leaving me a virtual voicemail. And again, I can play that on a future episode. It's entirely up to you. Whichever communication method you find easiest, you'll get a friendly reply from me. All I will ask, just don't attach anything to the emails and say the words, Neil, you must download this now, because you might just set off my tech spidey senses. Seriously though, keep your messages coming in. I love hearing from you all, and I love how our conversations are being beamed all around the world. But that's it from me today, so a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.